That last song, when you think of an altar and you think of God the Father with arms outstretched, ready to receive you, I think we can forget that too often. And we should remember that image, that when we accepted him, when we decided we were going to follow him, that he embraced us, that his arms came open wide. He maybe hauled us up on his lap, but something changed in our lives. And I think it's just an image that we need to think about from time to time. So today, we're going to take a look at Joshua chapter 6. Joshua chapter 6, and it may or may not be a familiar story for you. It depends on where you come from. You might remember the story as you go along. And I know for me as a kid, I don't know that I would have remembered the story, but I certainly remembered Tennessee Ernie Ford belting out from the record player singing Joshua Fit the Battle of Jericho. And and it's one of those stories that there are tons and tons and tons of lessons and sermons. There's tons and tons of stories written for kids. And it's a fun one to do really with kids, because you can have Lego here and you can have kids build block walls and then smash them down. You can do all sorts of things with them. But let's open up our minds and our hearts today to see what God might say to us through this story once again. See, we find Joshua comes into the book of Numbers, really. In the beginning is an aide of Moses. And he rises up through the ranks and he becomes second in command over all of Israel and becomes God's chosen successor of Moses to lead the people into the promised land. Now, it's interesting. We should take note that names are important. They aren't just necessarily identifiers the way we use them. Names carry meaning and weight and purpose. Abram's name was changed to Abraham to signify him as the father of many nations. Jacob's name was changed to Israel, representing Israel's struggle with God. And Joshua's name stands out. Joshua's name means something. In Hebrew, it's pronounced Yeshua. Translated into English as Jesus, or into Spanish as Jesus. And since I don't believe God does anything by accident, I believe that Joshua is part of the journey, part of the pointing towards Jesus. The literal meaning of both their names is to deliver, to save, or to rescue. Now, in this instance, we're going to read the story. Joshua delivers and saves the nation of Israel as he leads it into the promised land. Fast forward to Jesus, he delivers and saves us because he conquered sin and death. So let's look in Joshua chapter 6, starting at verse 1. It says, "Now Jericho was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out, and no one came in. Then the Lord said to Joshua, 'See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men. March around the city once with all the armed men. Do this for 6 days. Have 7 priests carrying trumpets of ram's horns in front of the ark. On the 7th day, march around the city 7 times, with the priests blowing the trumpets. When you hear them sound a long blast on the trumpets, have all the people give a loud shout. Then the wall of the city will collapse, and the people will go up, every man straight in.' So Joshua, son of Nun, called the priests and said to them, 'Take up the ark of the covenant of the Lord, and have 7 priests carry trumpets in front of it.' And he ordered the people, 'Advance, march around the city with the armed guard going ahead of the ark of the covenant.' And the story goes on from there that they did exactly what God said, and lo and behold, they had victory. Now, the first thing you might want to notice from this is that if any person had come up with that plan, they would have been considered a harebrain. They would have been looked at like they had marbles loose and everything else. Okay, guys, here's what we're going to do. We're going to march around the city once a day for on seventh day. We'll do it 7 times. Then we'll shout and the walls will fall down. How about that? That makes perfect sense, doesn't it? Not at all. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any human sense at all. The reality is, in our minds, we need to conquer a fortified city. It says, right in the beginning, it was tightly shut up because of the Israelites. No one went out and no one came in. They were on guard. They were waiting for the attack. And that's what we would do. We would build siege weapons. We would bombard them. We would knock down walls. We would try to create a nuclear missile. You break the gate. You create barriers and blockades, but you don't just wander around the place. You don't just take a stroll around it. But that's what God tells Joshua to do. I mean, if we look through the Bible, it's not like that's a one-time thing for God to tell somebody to do something that doesn't make any sense. I mean, he had Noah build a giant boat when it hadn't rained. He starts a nation with a man and a woman who have not only don't have children, they're way beyond the time when they could have children. And he chooses the youngest, the runt, David, to become king. He chooses to save humans, all of us, from the sin that will kill us by sending his son to die on a cross. And to us, it'll never make sense. But it makes perfect sense to God. It makes perfect sense to God. Isaiah 55, 8-9 says, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts." God knows what he's doing. Some of you have heard this story before, some of you haven't. But there's times when God tells you to do things and it really doesn't make sense. So a number of years ago, almost 25 years ago, Mary and I were taking a couple of friends of ours on a retreat for the weekend when we were with Youth for Christ. And we had a sponsor. They had a very nice cabin in the Muskokas. It was a lovely, way more than a cabin. It was a Viceroy home, and it was beautiful. And we'd been there before, and so the owner had said to me, the key for the front door is in the outhouse. Righto, got that. No, not a problem. I know where the outhouse is. And so we drove. We took the couple with us, drove the 4 hours from our home, arrived in there close to midnight. Wheel into the driveway. There's no outhouse. I don't know where the outhouse is because it's not where it used to be. Fine. So this creates an issue. So we look around the house and thought, well, maybe there's a window cracked open or something that we could go in. And no, there isn't. It's a really new place, so everything is locked up. And I was kind of muttering at God at the time and said, well, Lord, could you do something? And at that moment, I walked over to our van and I got the keys out, and my friend said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Something." And I went over with Mary's ring of keys, actually, not even mine, and started trying them on the front door of that big fancy cabin. And my friend said, "I was just about to call you a flaming idiot when you put a key in and unlocked the door." And the key for Mary's place of employment actually opens the door of that cottage. So when we say that God can do things, when he tells you to do something and it doesn't make any sense, it doesn't mean he's not fixing things. But he does know what he's doing. And it might look really foolish for us to put our hope in God. But we can't see what he can see, and we can't touch what he can touch. It might seem foolish to work at the place you work in, or or go some of the places you do when you could be doing something else, and yet God says, no, this is what I have for you. Proverbs 14:12 says, there's a way that appears to be right, but in the end it leads to death. And that way is our way. Jesus is the only way, and he says so. I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me. And if I want to find life, if I want to have life in my life, the only way to do it is by following the one who loves doing things in such a way that nobody can argue about who did it. Nobody could argue about whether Jericho was taken over by God because of the way it was done. You want to hold on to your life, you're going to lose it. You want to save your life? Give it to Christ. Lay it down. Let it go. But even before God says to Joshua, oh, by the way, I got something crazy for you to do, he already declared victory. Let's look in verse 2. Then the Lord said to Joshua, see, I have delivered Jericho into your hands along with its king and its fighting men. Now, before he even gives them the instruction that he has to walk around the city 7 days, he says, see, you have victory. Now, that doesn't make any sense. But God speaks to Joshua describing the events or the actions that haven't even happened as if they've already been accomplished. God declares victory over Jericho before one Israelite ever took a step into that journey around the city. And the reality is if you're his, he's declared that victory over you, over the struggles and the sins that you have. Before your heart was ever created, before you were a twinkle in your parents' eyes, God declared victory over sin and death. Okay. We see it even in the beginning, where God places a curse on the serpent, who represents sin and death. He said that the offspring of the woman would crush the serpent's head. And I don't know about you, but generally when something has a crushed head, it's not moving much after that. That's a fatal wound. And God declared victory over sin and death long before a baby was born in Bethlehem, long before the plan was laid out, long before that man would carry a cross and die, and long before you ever were born and sinned. So what is the nature of this battle? Why did they have to do it? We have to understand that numbers are important in Hebrew. And we're not talking about numerology, but symbolism. The number 7 shows up many, many times. There are 7 priests, 7 trumpets, leading the march around Jericho. They go around for 7 days, once each day for 6 days, and 7 times on the 7th day. And the reality is that in the Bible, 7 is a number that's associated with perfection. It goes all the way back to Genesis 1, where God created in 7 days, 6 days of work and a day of rest. And we can probably draw some conclusions from that. First of all, God's plans are perfect. From a human standpoint, God's plans may look foolish, may not make any sense to us. Who conquers a city by walking around it a bunch of times? And yet, what is foolish to us is God's wisdom. And what seems wise to us is often foolishness to God. But I can guarantee you this, that if you want to go through the Bible again and again and again, you will not find God's plans that fail. And the reality is, for my own life, if I'm following what God has laid out for me, when I'm following His will, I don't fail. But time after time I do, when I decide to go my own way, when I don't know for certain that I'm in God's plan. But also, 7 also signifies that this battle isn't just a fight. It isn't just a way for God to show off. It's a spiritual exercise for the people of Israel. Are they going to trust in the God who is telling them to do something no one in their right mind would do? It's not just about conquering Jericho. It's about the spiritual battle using spiritual weapons that's facing each one of us today. 2 Corinthians 10:3 and 4 says, "For though we live in the world, we do not wage war as the world does. The weapons we fight with are not the weapons of the world. On the contrary, they have divine power to demolish strongholds." The nature and the weapons of the warfare that God wages are not of flesh. They are of the Spirit. The Battle of Jericho wasn't just about knocking down a few walls around a city. It was about demolishing strongholds within the hearts of the people of Israel. God was trying to change his people. And the weapons weren't swords and spears. It was the presence of God and their obedience to him. The reality is that every one of us have a Jericho in our lives, maybe more than one. We all have strongholds that God wants us to overcome. And the only way to truly conquer them is to trust in Christ and do what he directs at the time he directs. Many of you know the story of Mary and I coming here. Many of you know that we didn't send a resume out anywhere. But all of a sudden, this lovely lady named Marjorie was calling us and saying, "Oh, would you come up to Kirkland Lake?" And we go, "What the heck is a Kirkland Lake?" And lo and behold, the journey, we come up. And we come up for our interview, and some of you know some of that story and some of you don't. But I know on the way up, we said, well, being as we didn't send a resume, we have to go because it wasn't us that did it. And so we came. And on the way up, I remember Mary praying this in the front of the van, saying, "Well, Lord, this is north, not south. You know that it's a lot colder up here, right, God? And I don't like cold, right, God? So this place we're going, that house better have a nice sunroom on it." And when we walked through the door, a lady grabbed Mary's arm and said, "I got to show you something," and marched her right out to the sunrooms. And in the window of the sunroom was a little stained glass hummingbird, and that is Mary's favorite bird. So she came out of there before we ever had the interview, before we had dinner or anything. She says, "I think we're moving to Kirkland Lake, hon." God steps in and does it in such a way that you can't deny that it's him. But we all have our Jerichos. We all have things that we need to overcome. And God may ask us to do things that don't seem to make sense. Like someone overcoming addiction, having to take a year away from their family and work to overcome their addiction. Or leaving a job that's secure, a job that pays the bills, a job that my father would used to say would give you ulcers, to a job that God calls you to, but it might not pay the bill. Moving to a new place where you know no one. What are the things that God's asking you to do that seem insurmountable? But here we have to remember verse 2. "See, I have delivered Jericho into your hands, along with its king and its fighting men." God already has declared your victory. He's already declared that you are a victor. Romans 8:37 tells us that we are more than conquerors through Christ Jesus. And that nothing can overcome us. And Isaiah 54:7 tells us that no weapon formed against us shall prosper. But that's because our weapons, if we're focused on Christ, aren't weapons of the flesh, but of the Spirit. And Jesus has already won the battle and the war for each one of us. So the story of the Battle of Jericho isn't just about the conquering of a city so long ago. It's about the story about the battle that you are fighting, that we are fighting, that I am fighting right now. And so are we going to listen when God may tell us to do something that seems a little odd? Are we going to step into it, or are we going to hide from it?